Justice Alito?
I'd like your response to the argument that these racial categories are so broad that any use of them is arbitrary and therefore unconstitutional. So what would you say to, for example, a student whose family came from Afghanistan and doesn't get in because the student doesn't get the plus factor that the student would get if the student's family had come from someplace else? So you would say to the student, well, we don't need you to contribute to a diversity of views at our school because we already have enough Asians. We have a lot of students whose families came from China or other Asian countries. And the student says, well, you don't have anybody like me. I'm from Afghanistan. What similarity does a family background of a person from Afghanistan have with somebody whose family's background is in, let's say, Japan?
So respectfully, what you're describing is the exact opposite of how our process actually works on an individualized basis. We discussed this on page 11 of our brief. There was a Vietnamese student. The admissions officer testified about a Vietnamese student who immigrated to a remote part of North Carolina and thrived in that setting. And she testified, undisputed, that was a favorable aspect of her application.
Well, that's an individual aspect of the application and something that has to do with her experience. But what is the justification for lumping together students whose families came from China with students whose families came from Afghanistan? What do they have in common?
So I agree that would be a strange rule, and that is not the rule that this court has established.
Well, then why do you have them check a box that I'm Asian? What do you learn from the mere checking of the box?
So we think that it depends on the individual circumstances of that person. But
so you don't need the boxes at all.
So I think that is not necessarily true on an individualized basis. So another example. So we, again, as I discussed, we attempt very vigorously to recruit and enroll rural students. And we don't ask them to write their essay about how being from a rural background affects their sense of self and their experiences. But what we say is that person comes with something that we value.
Well, they may choose to write about it. But what's the answer to my question? Why do you have these boxes? Why do you give a student the opportunity to say, this one thing about me, I'm Hispanic, I'm African American, I'm Asian. What does that in itself tell you?
We think that it can, in context, on a individualized basis, perhaps not in every case, but in some cases, give important information about where that person is coming from, what their experiences have been. And really, this goes to the heart of the dispute that we have between the parties. So they say on page 53 of their brief that race says nothing about who you are. And we just don't think that is true when you look at American society as it exists. We think that in the context of everything else that we know about an applicant, it can matter, not always, and there's no automatic plus factor that's given, but it can matter what an applicant's racial background is.
Let me just ask one more related question, and that is, the circumstance, this is a real problem, and I've heard it described to me by people who face it. When can a student honestly claim to fall within one of these groups that is awarded a plus factor? So let's say the student has one grandparent who falls within that class. Can the student claim to be a member of an underrepresented minority?
Yes, we rely on self-reporting, and we don't give it.
One great-grandparent.
If that person believes that that is the accurate expression of their identity, I don't think there would be any.
One great-great-grandparent. You're going to make me continue to go on.
Right. I think that as we go on, I agree that it would seem less plausible that that person would feel that this is actually capturing my true racial identity. But the same is true for any of the other diversity factors that we. It's
family lore that we have an ancestor who was an American Indian.
So I think in that particular circumstance, it would be not accurate for them to say, based on
I identify as an American Indian because I've always been told that some ancestor back in the old days was an American Indian.
Yeah, so I think in that circumstance, it would be very unlikely that that person was telling the truth. And the same is true for, we rely on self-reporting for all the demographic and other characteristics that we ask for. And there's nothing special about the racial identification on that score, Your Honor.